let us get started. Please do go ahead, folks, and introduce yourselves in the chat. I am Jacqueline Friedman. I use she, her pronouns. I am the founder and executive director of Educate Us. I'm just actually realizing, okay, we are recording. My head's not all the way screwed on straight this week, if I'm being perfectly honest, but I'm really glad to be here with everybody this week, and I wonder if we're not all feeling a little that way. As I said, I'm the founder and executive director of Educate Us. We are an organization building power and for sex ed around the country, and we are really glad to be building that power with you. This is a no means no event. We have these events with means KNOW once a month, so that folks like you can come together and we can learn together about how to be better advocates for sex ed. We always learn knowing something a little bit more about how to do better advocacy work. And these are free events. Although if you get something out of it and you value it and you want to make a donation, I'll be dropping that link in the chat. We run on your donations, so we really appreciate anything you can give. And Also, this is being recorded. It'll go up on YouTube afterwards, so you'll definitely get access to it afterwards. If you do have questions, you don't have to wait until the end to ask them, although we will have a dedicated Q&A section of the program. But if you want to get started with your questions, you can always put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. We won't really be able to find all your questions if they're in the chat. So if you want a question answered by one of the panelists, make sure to put them in the Q&A section. All right, I think that about covers it. Everyone be respectful to each other. Use common sense. And with that, I'm really excited because we are here tonight to learn about how to be better at organizing with Gen Z folks who have so much to offer. I know that we're in the third year of having a youth advisory board program at Educate Us, and it has really incredibly shaped the way that we do our work and think about our work, and also our capacity to do the work because the folks on our youth advisory board do incredible projects themselves, and also has been a real incredible feeder for our leadership, including one of our guests tonight, Sydney Turner, who is actually the board chair of our 501(c)(3, the Educate Us Fund, and I'm sure she'll say more about that. And also joining us is her colleague and friend and compatriot, Ella Dennis, who's an incredible organizer in her own right. So I'm going to shut up because I'm Gen X and turn the program over to Ella and Sydney.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Okay, my thing went out for a second. Thank you, Jacqueline. We're just gonna do quick intros and then I'm gonna hand it over to Ella, who I'm so glad could join us for this event, to kind of share about her story. And as I introduce myself, I'm going to share my screen. But my name is Sydney Turner, like Jacqueline said. I am the board chair of the Educate Us Fund, and I'm also on the board of our 501(c)(4, Educate Us. I graduated from the University of Illinois, and I currently work for Planned Parenthood of Illinois as well as Carle Health in Illinois. And I use she, her pronouns. That's a little intro, but I'm excited to pass it over to my friend Ella to start us off.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sydney and Jacqueline, for having me here. I'm so excited to be in space with you all tonight. I know it's probably, well, maybe freezing where you are. I know there's like 5 feet of snow outside my window, so I hope you're staying warm. But yeah, as Sydney said, I have been kind of in the organizing work as well. I'm also a grad of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Currently, I serve as the Director of Policy at the Alliance for Civic Engagement, which is a student-centered think tank focusing on building a strong, diverse policy pipeline of folks prepared to cultivate a more informed voting public. But I also have deep roots in the anti-gender-based violence field. So a lot of my work organizing as a student on campus was at the organization I founded, It's On Us at UIUC, which is a chapter of the larger It's On Us organization, primarily focused on peer-to-peer prevention, but we also did some de facto kind of grassroots survivor support work as well. In order to kind of kick things off, we want to make this a conversation, not just us lecturing at you. So we're going to devote a large part of this time to a Q&A. So feel free to start thinking of questions if you don't have them already. We really are just here to be resources to you all because we know that you're doing fantastic work out in the fields in your own communities as well. But to start off, I'm going to give some context on my journey into organizing and some of the things that worked really well for me and where I felt really valued as a younger person in this work. Then I'm going to pass it over to Sydney she'll do the same thing, and then we'll go over some general best practices that have kind of emerged from our journeys before opening it up for Q&A. But like I said, my journey with organizing really did start when I was an undergrad in college. So I came in knowing that I was already passionate about consent education. I was doing research in a psych lab on marketing campaigns to prevent sexual and dating violence among young people. Because the one thing that I saw on campus, my mom had given me pepper spray as my You're an Adult Woman gift. All of my friends already had stories of experiences in bars or in alleyways, and oftentimes either they didn't report, which is absolutely understandable because the ones who did report were often retaliated against either by fraternities, by the larger organization, by Title IX. So this is something that I saw just kind of pervasively everywhere around me when I was on the college campus. And this definitely was exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. We were just kind of exiting lockdown as I was entering college, so it felt more isolated than ever. And that's why I started coalition building, was honestly to feel more supportive, more supported by those in my small circle, and that circle started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think one thing that Gen Z is very, very good at is that just kind of organic coalition building, whether that be in Discord, in GroupMe, over Instagram. We are really plugged in digitally, and I think especially from COVID, we learned how to leverage those tools effectively. And so what started out as just kind of a small group of people who would host support nights at the Women's Resources Center turned into an 100+ member organization where we were giving workshops to athletics teams, working with the Title IX office, doing prevention in frat houses. And again, all of that told me that young people have so much kind of latent power. We just need to be empowered to use it and know that we are able to kind of do change within our networks and with the people that are already alongside us, telling each other our stories. So after a few years of doing work with It's On Us at UIUC, kind of building up that prevention work, doing a lot of workshops with frats, I was contacted by Carrie Schwartz at the Adjacent Project. If you don't know them, they're wonderful. They're a grassroots collective formed by Carrie's daughter, Emma, basically on a mission to codify stealthing or non-consensual condom removal as sexual assault nationwide. And they've had a lot of success in different states. They were looking to create an amendment in Illinois, which is where I was based. And this is really the first time that I had been contacted by an adult who kind of saw my insights or my testimony as really critically important to their campaign. So she asked me if I could tap into my network to deliver a testimony to the Illinois House Judiciary Committee. And because of the networks that I had kind of already built and that existed on campus, we were able to do a really quick turnaround and put out a survey and just a bunch of feelers on campus to get first person stories from survivors of stealthing specifically. And we were able to generate literally over 10 different stories, 10 different first person accounts of this within 2 days. And all of these people were informed that their anonymous testimony would be shared. And I was able to bring that forth to the House committee, and that ended up being really impactful. And I think to me, that really just showed that young people involved in the grassroots work are some of your most direct routes to tap into the realities that people are facing on the ground. Because it's one thing to just kind of send out a survey or a Google form to like your local Title IX office or Women's Resources Center. It's another thing to get in touch directly with the organizers who have their friends, who have their networks, who know people who would be comfortable sharing things. So that was my experience on campus. 2 years after graduation, I still consider myself deeply involved in the kind of youth advocacy sphere. Right now, I'm at the Alliance for Civic Engagement, which, like I said, is a student-centered organization. So other than our wonderful executive director, every single person who works there in the senior leadership team, our managers, are either students or very recent graduates. And I think that's another organization where day to day, we really try to embody the idea that your capacity is going to be your limiting factor for progress, not your age. So we really take people at face value. We don't assume what they can and cannot do based on whether or not they're still a student. And that has been our biggest strength as an organization. Some of the most talented, effective leaders, some of the most bold, really strategic thinkers that I know and I'm privileged to have in my circle are younger than I am. And they're really not defined by how old they are, what degree they have. And again, that's what has propelled us as an organization so far. So those are some examples, I think, of what has worked for me as an organizer and what has worked when people in my sphere and adults in my sphere have really genuinely valued the kind of unique capacities that young people bring to the table. So I'm going to pass it over to Sydney to share a little bit more about her background and the nuanced experiences that she's run into. But that was just a little context.
Thank you so much, Ella. I'm so excited to continue hearing from you in our Q&A. As Ella said, I'm going to share a little bit about my journey. So I come from the great state of Minnesota. I grew up in Minneapolis, and which we all know, especially in this moment, to be a place very invested in activism and that really raised me in the idea that if you have a belief in something that you can actually make change on that front. So I was in high school and I say that my organizing and activism journey began on my high school speech team. I was 15 years old, advocating at the state level to include consent and sex education with poetry pieces. I was 16 years old talking about how the mental health stigma for Black women leads to the violence that we face. And I was very successful in that. I won state. I went to nationals 4 times. I was all conference. I did many things. And it really showed me that my voice had power and that it could actually be listened to if I just knew how to articulate it and if I just knew how to hone that power. I brought that into college and I took, like Ella, which is where we met kind of in the violence prevention advocacy space on our campus. I took our mandatory workshop that we have at the University of Illinois called First Year Consent and Relationships Education, and which is a mandatory workshop that all first year students have to take surrounding that topic. And I realized that I was like, oh, I didn't know this was something I could do as a job. Like, I didn't know that like you could get paid or like you could study like consent and relationships and sexual violence and feminism and things like that. Those were all things that I was like, these just exist in my little speech world. But I was like, wow, I can actually do these things as a part of my career. And so I enrolled in that class to become a facilitator of that program. I went on to facilitate to thousands of students for the next 3 years on consent and relationships education. And I worked at many dozens of roles on campus involved in that realm, involved in activism. Culminating in my two most proud accomplishments from college are that as a representative of a violence prevention space on campus, I authored improvements to our campus safety email for sex crimes, which is sent to every single person who has an Illinois email address, which the University of Illinois is huge. So around 80 to 100,000 emails, and I authored improvements to that email to make them more survivor centered. And this will come into play when I kind of summarize my ideas in a second. But I did that as a basically an advanced intern making $12 an hour. And then at the same vein, I was a representative of Planned Parenthood Generation Action at the University of Illinois, where as the health policy director, I co-authored a referendum to advocate for abortion, a medication abortion accessibility on campus, which then several years later transitioned into House Bill 3709, which was recently signed into law in August of last year by Pritzker. So now all public colleges and universities in Illinois have to mandate medication abortion accessibility, which was largely because of the bill that I helped create. Those were my experiences largely on campus. I was super involved in basically anything that involved like repro, sexual violence prevention, feminism, things like that. I was a gender and women's studies minor, and so I was super involved in every place that I could get my hands in on campus. I brought that off campus in a number of different organizations, which really allowed me to see the differences from where on campus it's largely people of the same age, of the same circumstance, and the same kind of experience doing activism together. Whereas outside, I was able to bring in that perspective of being surrounded by other young people all the time to organizations that were more so led by people much older than me. I did several internships and things around the violence prevention advocacy space, and really got to learn what I wanted to transition to next, which was working more in the national sector. I worked with an organization called Safe Bay, which is a national organization that is youth led, focused on sexual violence prevention for teens. I was on the board. I eventually became in a manager and director role. I oversaw with my colleagues national programs for peer educators for sexual violence prevention. I traveled all over the country speaking to thousands of professionals and students and mentoring them about how to advocate for sexual violence prevention in their communities. And then at that same time, I got introduced to Educate Us. And I remember being at a conference that Jacqueline was speaking at and being like, oh my gosh, Jacqueline Friedman, she's so famous. I'm scared to speak to her. And I was applying to be on our youth advisory board at that time. Genuinely believed I wasn't going to get on it because I was surrounded in this group interview that we had with all of these other Gen Z organizers who were so talented and so like articulate in what they were saying. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm so used to just being at the university where everybody is kind of similar to me or like, doing the same stuff. And I'm like, oh, I'm not going to get in this. I got on the youth advisory board and started to really get into how to organize really intentionally for sex education advancement, beyond just on the ground work that I was doing on campus, which is quite different than what we do virtually at Educate Us. And so then a year later, I was asked to be on the board of directors. And then a year later, now I'm the president of our new 501(c)(3, the Educate Us Fund. And what I have seen in all of these experiences kind of together, and I think Ella mentioned something like this as well, has been that we can't just assume that if an organization is youth led or if I'm a part of an organization that is largely run by young people, that I'm going to have the same representation as other young people. Because what I've seen from campus as well as a lot of organizations that I've worked at is on campus, like I said, a lot of us are having similar experiences. But one thing that when I got off campus and started working at organizations is I was like, I don't think that everybody is perceiving the competition between young organizers as accurate. Because when I was on campus, I was like, wow, this is really bad sometimes. And I got to more kind of national organizations like Educate Us. And I was seeing that, wow, like when you are not surrounded by the same age of organizers all the time, your perception of what youth led and what like mobilizing young people is actually quite different. And what I mean by that, for a specific example, is that in my time at the University of Illinois, when I was creating those two large accomplishments that are my most proud things that I accomplished as a student, when I was writing the edits to the campus safety emails, that was largely something that I was completely uncredited for, because I was a student and because I was not a representative of the organization that I was working on behalf of as the person who was older than me and who had an established full-time role at the organization. I wasn't able to utilize the experience that I had at other organizations like Safe Bay and internships that I had, even though I was working really like roles where I had a lot of responsibility, as much as anybody who is maybe 10, 15 years older than me might have. I wasn't able to bring that experience into that to have the same power as someone who would be accomplishing, say, creating that email, simply because I was a student. This also appeared in my other accomplishment of writing the referendum to get medication abortion on campus, because in the signing of this bill that happened last year, I was largely uncredited and left out, whereas the other authors of the bill, the other organizers of the bill, who were largely white women, were credited more and given more ability to represent this cause. And what this has taught me, among all my experiences, the good and the bad, the ones where, like, Educate Us is definitely the good. I definitely am being able to step into this ability and this responsibility in a way that is actually representative of my skills, my experience, and just who I am as a person. Um, but what it taught me as I've been in these experiences where I was uncredited for work or seen as just a student or things like that is that sometimes my best advocate in those times was someone who was much older than me. It's not always going to be somebody who is my age because a lot of times that we've seen in organizing and in young people being kind of the face of a movement, a lot of times we might, like, if you're an older person, you might expect that, like, Gen Z are going to organize with Gen Z and they're going to advocate for Gen Z. But what I hope to be able to inspire in the older generations that I work with is how to actually be an advocate for Gen Z in a way that maybe you might be advocating for them against people who are their age, which is not always what we would expect. Sometimes you might expect that it's going to be like, oh, I'm an older person and I'm going to help Gen Z, kind of deal with the struggles of dealing with people who are in my generation. But I think that that's not really what intergenerational organizing is. Intergenerational organizing isn't just old people to young people, not to say old, but like older people to younger people or younger people to older people. It is intermixed. And that also, like I said, involves knowing who you're advocating for and how to advocate for them in a way where you really understand what the target is. Um, and so that is kind of my journey. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about takeaways that both Ella and I have had from both of our journeys. But we want to kind of summarize a couple of things we talked about with some general best practices that we both have thought about. And then feel free to ask more about these in the Q&A or other things that might come up. But some general things that we think are important to do, these are the right things to do when it comes to organizing with Gen Z as somebody who is maybe older than, Gen Z in a generation or people who maybe are amongst Gen Z, because I'm sure that there are many people in this call who are similar in age to me and Ella. Is first, obviously, treating young organizers as capable and powerful. And what I want to say about that as well is not just treating us as capable and powerful in terms of like, we have this capable and powerful Gen Z organizer on our board, and they are powerful as a young person, but instead they are capable and powerful as a person, and as somebody who brings a certain like set of experience and techniques and things like that that are different or similar to people who might be older than them. So treating us as capable and powerful as people and not just young people. Soliciting and offering caring feedback, and when you ask for it, act on it. Um, the way I think about this is offering feedback as a term of, I always think of this as like something that needs to be done consensually. Like offering feedback, offering it in a way where it is the same that you would offer feedback to, like, I'm speaking as though maybe this is an older person who is maybe supervising a younger person or working with a younger person and wants to offer feedback. It's not going to be much different than if you're offering feedback to somebody who is of a similar age. I think a lot of times when I've offered or received feedback, it has been the most kind of tokenizing or problematic when it's like, you're telling me this because first and foremost, because I'm much younger. I can tell that you wouldn't be doing this in the same manner to somebody who is of similar age to you. So I think first recognizing us as, equal colleagues, and then recognizing the feedback that can be provided in a caring manner and one that, like I said, still recognizes our personhood. And also, when it comes to older generations asking for feedback, like saying, how can we be better? Actually doing what is provided by Gen Z organizers and actually following through on that and showing that you genuinely care about listening to them as, like we said, powerful and capable organizers. Along with that, leading with curiosity and not assumptions. I'm sure, like Ella can agree, we've dealt with our fair share of assumptions when it comes to our age, different things. Like for example, I don't usually lead with things like the year I graduated or my age or maybe like circumstances that just reveal how young I am, or things like that, or just assumptions about my experience to make it seem like that I'm very early on in my career, which I am, but I just don't lead with things like that because they just create assumptions from people that I might want to get to know or be working with and stuff. So, a way to curb that is just by leading with curiosity at all times and leading with not assuming that just because someone is of this age or they graduated last year that they aren't going to be keep going back to being capable and powerful. I really love this point that Ella created of meeting Gen Z where they already organize. A lot of times, like I said, I've had a lot of experience organizing in places that are not youth led, and where you, as a Gen Z person, kind of have to find your way there. And which is fine because not every organization is going to be title youth led or, hone themselves on being, organized by and for young people entirely. But a great way to start is by actually going to the places, like physically and metaphorically, where Gen Z are organized. And the way I think of that is like actually being able to meet us where we're at, not just expecting us as young people who need to quote unquote learn from older generations to come to you and come to your organizations. And also in a metaphorical sense, meeting us in our perspective, not just assuming that we are going to adopt your way of looking at the world when it comes to organizing when we collaborate with you. We're meeting together and we're creating something together. And Ella, feel free to say anything you want to as well about those, but she's going to share about some of our don'ts.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Sydney. And I just want to echo that. I think some of the best collaborations that I've seen between like more institutionalized national nonprofits and people on the ground are those nonprofits going to the people on the ground and saying, what can we do for you? What can we do to amplify the things that are already happening rather than here's our national strategy, please adopt this to your local context. Because that way around doesn't really, it's not as effective because clearly the people on the ground already have a model that's working. Um, I will head over to the don't. I also see things popping up in the chat, so we can address those as well. The first big don't that I feel like is probably obvious, and we might have belabored it a bit, is just prioritizing optics over outcomes. So I think sometimes with youth boards or boards that have like a singular youth position that's like the designated young person, organizations can make themselves feel as if they're really meaningfully integrating Gen Z or young folks into their work when they're not. And this, of course, happens with any community that is underrepresented at places that are proximate to power. So just avoiding tokenism, for example, maybe questioning why do you have only one spot for a young person on your board? Why is that this kind of like the designated chair? How often does that person turn over? How often do you have new perspectives from young people? And that kind of bleeds into my second point, which is the fact that myself, Sydney, we do not speak for all people who are young. There are also multiple generations of young people, all having very different and nuanced experiences, especially with the rise of AI and gendered disinformation and all of that good stuff. There are going to be things that I'm not going to be able to answer questions about because I don't have experience with that. And I also, on this point, really just want to uplift what Sydney mentioned, which is the fact that I would not be here today were it for the fact that in addition to having impact and doing the hard work, I was able to brand and scale the work that I did to a point that it was appreciated and awarded by the powers that be. And so there was that kind of extra step that I needed to take to get that recognition as a youth organizer. And the fact that I'm a white woman absolutely helped with that. And there are so many young people every day that are doing what we call like organizing on a day-to-day basis to help themselves and their friends survive. There's mutual aid. There are grassroots food pantries. There are people going door to door handing out diapers. All of that good work isn't getting the fancy awards from the Obama Foundation usually because they're so focused on doing the work, number one, but also it's typically populations that aren't already proximate to power. So queer organizers, disabled organizers, all of those folks are often not uplifted as kind of representatives of the youth organizing community, but they really have always been the backbone of any organizing. So just want to uplift that as well. The third, Also, probably pretty obvious for anybody at an Educate Us panel, but just being extractive about people's stories, their trauma, their identity, using people as kind of poster children or pity children, especially with stories of dating or sexual violence, is a big no. And that can really fracture the trust that exists not only between your organization or your school and an individual, but also with their entire community and the networks that they're plugged into. And finally, this is the point that I really want to drive home, is mistaking hope for naivety. I have a wonderful professor who loves to say hope is not a strategy all the time. And while I get that, and I'm a very type A strategic thinker, I also think that hope is a skill. And hope is a muscle that you need to flex a lot to grow. And I think it's one that my generation has had to utilize a lot in our short time on this earth. And because of that, I think our perspectives that we bring, especially into the kind of advocacy, nonprofit organizing spaces, are incredibly valuable. And like said, I think a lot of times when we get into kind of entry level roles in the nonprofit kind of complex, we're almost not hazed, but we're told very quickly that there is a way that things are done, that there is a limit on the amount that we can expect. And in general, there's just kind of this standard operating procedure that our hope clashes with. And if we bring up an idea or we bring up a strategy that seems too hopeful, we're shut down because we're hopeful and we're young, so we seem naive. Um, I'm just here to say that hope can be formed on the basis of data, on the basis of things that have succeeded. And so when young people come to you hopeful, you should get really excited because it's really hard for young people to be hopeful right now. So it probably means they have a really good idea and they know it's probably going to work. So I'll leave it at that.
Um, can you take the slide down? I want people to see your faces on the recording. Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
Uh, can I jump in? There's some great questions in the Q&A that I want to get to, but I'm also going to use host privileges to follow up on a couple of questions. First of all, I want to second that thing about hope. I have to say, like working with our youth advisory board, like folks are feeling very overwhelmed and discouraged right now. So if a Gen Z ear comes to you with feeling hope, like you should pay attention. It is really hard. I mean, it's hard to be a person right now, but uh, I think it's probably especially hard to be trying to start your adult life right now. Yeah, I want to just underline that. A couple of things popped up for me when you were talking. One is the sort of thing about not being extractive about young people's stories. A conversation that I have among sort of older adult activists, not infrequently when it comes to young people telling stories, is like, how much should we be protective of young people who do want to tell their stories because we know what they're going to expose them to versus just being like, great, you want to tell a story? Come on out and tell a story. And like, I can never find a comfortable place on that question because I never want to say like, you don't know enough to make that decision for yourself. And like we have maybe seen more shit go down, so like and that sort of ties into the other question that I had, which is when I started the youth advisory board, I was very conscious of not wanting to condescend or assume like folks on the youth advisory board were not smart and talented and had things to offer. Obviously, Sydney was one of them. Sydney was in our first cohort. Obviously, has a lot to fucking offer. And I think that for some members of the youth advisory board, I actually went too far in the other direction and was like, we're all colleagues here. We all know all the same stuff. But like there is stuff that you learn by experience and being in the world longer. And there's also stuff that you all know that I don't know because I'm not in the same places you're at and I don't have the same perspective you have. So like how do you make space for like respecting Gen Z agency, right? While also supporting the fact that you are new to a lot of things and need to learn a lot of things. Like what's a good way to balance those two things?
Um, I can say that kind of for both of those questions, like talking about, I think it's kind of like honing on like what we were talking about when it comes to like how to provide like feedback or like be like balancing like working with older people who like objectively might have more experience like in something, many more years of experience, like in my case. And being able to share that in a way that's going to help young people learn, without being, like you said, like condescending and stuff like that. I definitely see this happening in the most positive way that I've experienced at Educate Us. Where like I have always felt like I came into, in my experience, I came into the board of directors as well as the presidency of the board of directors of the Educate Us Fund, telling Jacqueline I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like I am very confused about many things. Like there's so many things like I'm not sure that I can do this because I just don't know like what's going on about this stuff. I'm not sure I have the skills for this thing, whatever. And what I have seen collaborating with the boards and being in that leadership role is that we're all learning together. And it's just we're all being honest about what we know and what we've experienced, and then sharing it collectively, not singling one person out. And so I think a good way generally to balance it is just by, rather than kind of thinking about it in our heads like, oh, I'm an older person and this young person, maybe they are not aware of this kind of like say like when Jacqueline you said like if you want to share your story or do this thing that might have repercussions or be dangerous or whatever it might be, is not like thinking of it so much as like, oh, they don't know this because they're young, and how do I share it with them in a way that is like, not going to hurt their feelings or be condescending and stuff like that. And rather thinking of it like, this is my experience that is different than the one they are bringing to me. I can share that regardless of that person's age. And like I said, that kind of goes into like when it comes to feedback or like things we need to learn about, is like, somebody who is much older than me, like I'm going to have experiences that they don't. And that's the same, like I said, it's intergenerational. It's not just like one way to one way. And so I think it's just like being honest about like what you know and what you don't know, regardless of the reasons in which you might not know or know those things. Like kind of removing the idea that like you can only know things if you have this many years of experience or you're this age, or you cannot know things because you're this experience or you're this age. And just saying, but this is my experience, regardless of the reason why we got there, and kind of removing that barrier in our minds, I think just kind of helps us all to appear more equal or like equitable in terms of like collaborating. But I've definitely seen that happen at Educate Us. I've always felt like I could share my experience and I could learn from others and they could learn from me, and it didn't have to be I'm learning because I'm young and they're teaching because they're old. Or
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll keep my answer brief because most of it echoes what Sydney says, and we have some great questions in the chat as well. But I think a lot about providing scaffolding and then stepping away. Like Sydney said, I think just back to my experience in the professional realm, I worked full time at a domestic violence shelter straight out of undergrad, and I could very easily tell the difference between a conversation when somebody older than me was giving feedback through the lens of I am older, I am wiser, and you are a vessel of knowledge to be deposited into, versus I'm speaking to you as a colleague and here's some feedback. And I want to make it clear, we are not coming on this call to say we know everything. Quite the opposite. I love learning. I love being told that I'm wrong or that somebody has a challenge. Like, I love those discussions. The problem is when they're coming from unilateral correctness because I am older than you. So echoing that, and then also I think just providing resources and information as neutral objects, and then letting people do with that what they will. For example, the example you gave, Jacqueline, I think when working with folks who are preparing to share their stories, I think it's necessary, and I think of informed consent, to give them the information you have that you think might be useful. But then at the end of the day, it's up to them whether or not they choose to engage and how they choose to engage.
Thank you. And yeah, I would really echo for me, like the mutuality of those relationships is, I mean, that is, I know it's a sort of a cliche to talk about like strength through diversity, but like it's real, it's for real. I mean, look at Minneapolis right now. Um, okay, let's get to our Q&A. There's a growing demographic that rejects both parties and refuses to work with GEMS even temporarily and pragmatically, how do we talk to them? I assume a growing demographic of young people is what Joseph is asking. Have you seen that? Do you know those people? Are you those people? What do you think about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can speak to this one because that rings true with a lot of people in my circle and conversations that I've been having. And I think the first thing that comes to mind when I think about that question is I want to know like what perspective the question is coming from. Is it from maybe like a DNC or a local Democratic campaign, or is it from outside the Democratic Party? Because I think the way that you need to approach it with young people is very different in those two cases. If you're coming from a branch of the party, I think we need to be honest with the amount of trust that has been broken, over countless election cycles, not just what has happened in the past handful of years. And to be really honest with ourselves about why some people felt uncomfortable voting Democratic in the last presidential election. And there are absolutely valid there's valid rage at people who do not vote or who refuse to vote democratically because people feel that it led to this. There's also extremely valid rage at political platforms that have been held that did immense harm to people at home and abroad. And I think while we can do our best to educate folks on the ramifications of political participation, I don't think it is in anybody's best interest to lecture young people, especially young people with lived experience or family members who have been harmed or killed as a result of political platforms about how they should be voting. So I think there's a lot of delicacy that this needs to be approached with because I have seen a lot of finger pointing. And that definitely rubs me the wrong way because it goes back to that naivety conversation, acting as if young people are just like impulsively throwing out the idea of voting rather than saying, I've had a lived experience and I don't want to see a person in office. Is that devoid of strategy? Maybe to some people, but that doesn't mean that you can just use those populations as scapegoats, I think.
Yeah, and going off of what Ella said, I think like a very simple phrase that one time someone had said to me when I was in high school that we think of as obvious, but that like I think a lot of people should actually remind themselves of is your life will change when you realize that not everybody thinks the same way that you do. And when it comes specifically to this conversation, like what I mean by that is I think a lot of times we just operate and kind of even as like especially when it comes to like other people who like for example like when it comes to like issues like sex ed and stuff or a lot of the hot topic issues of the last election cycle like we all care about the general same things and so we're all kind of like involved in the same general like liberalism type like thing that's going on but the ways in which we go about it, we tend to, I feel like, just get very essentialist in the way we think, and very much like this is the way that things need to go, and the way that we will solve this, there's only one way. Like this, there's nothing that can be changed about just the way things are. And a lot of people interpret the phrase like history repeats itself as not always accurate, kind of like thinking that history repeats itself, meaning that the strategy in which we avoid history repeating itself is going to be the same every time, which it's not. And when it comes to like thinking about like if you just remind yourself strategically that not everybody thinks the same way that you do, specifically with what Ella was saying, is I feel like when it comes to like younger people, like what the question was asking, where it's like some of those younger people who or and older people as well. There are like people of all generations who think like this is where they want to reject kind of maybe like from what the question was saying, like working with Democrats or working with kind of the mainstream idea of what how we get to that, you know, the collective goal. Um, is just kind of like Ella was saying, like understanding that lived experience creates difference. And also that maybe two things can be true at the same time. Maybe that my way of believing that that's how we get there, and believing that strategy should include some amount of say working with the Democratic Party or doing this type of thing or voting or whatever it might be, that's kind of that mainstream idea of making it to that end goal. Maybe that can be combined with the people who don't want to vote and who want to reject that. It doesn't always have to be that we choose completely separate things and that one of them is only right or only wrong. That's not to say that it's important, that it's not important to understand that strategy needs to be specific, but it's also, like I said, just a lot of people get into this very like, we have a strong goal, therefore we need an absolutely steel opinion of the way in which we get there that can't be moved or can't be changed. And that's hard, obviously, when it's people who, like I said, care about the same things that we do. And I feel like that's almost easier to get into that steel way of thinking because we care so much about the same kind of idea. Whereas the opposing kind of team, like, the people who are antis about what we're doing, we not only don't like the way they're going about things, but we also don't have the same goal in the end. And so it's easier, I think, to kind of go against them because it's all of those different things. But when it's people who are on the same kind of team, like we want liberation, we want all these things, we just think about it in a different way. It's easy to get in that way, but sometimes I think can be as simple, like when it comes to conversations and the more like day-to-day things of just reminding ourselves that the way I see the world is not the same as everyone else.
Uh, can I add a little intergenerational answer to this also? My perspective is two things I want to add. One is that is actually one of the magic things about what we do here at Educate Us, which is that we work on local elections, namely school board elections. And we have found that a great way to get young people willing to engage in an electoral process is to make it really clear what kind of impact that they can have. And sex ed is an issue that Gen Z absolutely does care about. And if you tell Gen Z that sex ed is on the ballot in the election that might be decided by 100 votes, like it's actually a great way to get young people starting to think about civic engagement that makes sense, and meets them where they are, literally where they are in their local community. And the other thing I would say is like in the question was sort of phrased like, how do we talk to them? And I would say, and this is cross-generational advice, if you want to move somebody, like one of the best things you can do is listen to them and get curious about them. Make them feel genuinely heard and not judged, and like listen to understand, like listen to try and get better understanding. So, um, to like not come at it from like I have to say the right set of words and then I will persuade you, but like what if we could actually understand each other better as a starting point is always a better starting point for creating that kind of shift. Okay, there's another question in the Q&A. What are some guidelines or advice you would offer for helping us avoid burning out Gen Z activists and advocates who are engaged in our work? Um, yeah, is that specific to Gen Z? I'm curious about that. How do we all not burn out?
Yeah, I have major thoughts on that. Just I think going back to what I said about the grind set that exists in nonprofits broadly, but in any social impact work. And I think being a really intentional model, especially for the young professionals in your space, is so important. So even taking your lunch break. Please take your lunch break in front of people, or please model saying, I will respond to your email when I am in office tomorrow. Even the email signatures that say things along those lines. All of those things have taught me in my professional career that those are not only okay things to model, but they're signs of professionalism as well. So one, being a role model, and two, I think just having very open and honest conversations about that at the start. So if you're hosting an intern or you're working with young people, you can have an open conversation and say, hey, like I know we're doing onboarding right now. I know you're incredibly passionate about this work, as am I. I just want to let you know that doing this every day can get really, really, really rough and tiring. And you probably already know that. So maybe let's go through some strategies that you're already using to take care of yourself. And how can we create like an accountability plan to make sure that you continue to do that? Not in a patronizing way, but just in a way that says, hey, I'm already doing this and that's why I'm still here. So this might be something to do early on. Those are things that have helped me personally.
Yeah, and I'll also say briefly that when it comes to like maybe like being an older person who like Ella said, like has an intern or has someone who can do work on your behalf or like that benefits you, treat us like people who have lives. Like it's so simple, but like a lot of people like think that they're not, that they're like that they are doing that, that they're like, oh yeah, like of course this is, a 23-year-old who has a life and has a full-time job. But a lot of times I have experienced that a lot in the past where I was just kind of doing a lot of free labor and I wasn't getting recognized for it, paid for it. Like, it was just kind of assumed that like we're young people who need to get to that. There's like this assumption that we need to do all of that, like the free labor, the extra stuff, in order to get to a certain point. Like it's kind of like a rite of passage to get to where you want to be in your career. And that is just so toxic and immediately like was the cause of a lot of my burnout and a lot of my past experiences. So just treat us like how like you might think like, oh, I have a life, so I can't, I'm not going to be answering my emails at this time. I'm not going to be doing this thing. Treat us like people who are like that too, even if it's an intern, even if we're, only working with you 5 hours a month. Treat us like people who have lives that require balance.
Thank you. Can we squeeze one question in? It's in the chat, but I thought it was a really good question. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you to be brief in answering it. Um, any best practices for having productive conversations cross-generationally when stigma and taboo are also barriers?
I think for that, I what comes up for me is exactly what Jacqueline said in relation to the political party question too, is just leading with curiosity. When I think about dialogue across any type of difference, that's the first and probably maybe only thing that I find to be effective. Because like Jacqueline said, I mean, we're all coming to conversations with our own strong convictions, and there's no way to dissipate that. But if you come to a conversation, I think with a very clear end goal in mind that is not to understand, it's really apparent to the other person, even if you don't intend it to be. And I know even from my experience, my grandparents are from a small town in central Illinois, share very different lived experiences, different political views that I'm sometimes appalled by. And as we've had these conversations and I've gotten them to kind of be more aware of things that I've become aware of, all of that has come through just sitting with them for literal hours and listening to their stories and showing that I am genuinely engaged in what they're saying as a human being, because I think that allows them to open up and then have trust in me when I might offer a differing opinion.
Yeah, and very quickly, just to kind of touch on one of the words that Ella said that I think is just a great strategy when it comes to dealing with taboo topics in general is just like emphasizing storytelling and emphasizing sharing about lived experiences. When it comes to like educate us, we love storytelling, we love canvassing, we love relational organizing, and it really works, I think, when it comes to like uncomfortable topics that we talk about, like when it comes to teaching sex like to kids and stuff like that. Um, is like I think that really helps not only inspire further collaboration between older generations and younger generations and intermixing that and allowing it to be productive, because you can really see each other as people and also understand the ways in which you experience that stigma differently. Because that has always been, I think, a barrier for me when it comes to dealing with stigmatizing topics with older generations, is that I worry that they're going to have like assumptions about the way I perceive those things because I'm much younger than them and because I experience it differently. So when it comes to like being able to share about like this has been my experience or this is like, my story that I have to share about this thing, it has helped to kind of challenge that barrier as well as inspire further relational organizing and collaboration.
Everything is relationships, like we like to say here at Educate Us. So, and I'm so glad that we also have relationships with both with Ella as well as with Sydney. I hope that you'll consider yourself part of the larger Educate Us family now that you joined us. Really grateful to both of you. This has been great, and it's making me think about something that I had to learn as I stepped into my role here, which is I had some ideas about being a boss that were really from having had some toxic bosses and was like accidentally embodying things that I was like, well, now that I have the power, I get to do these things. And I wasn't doing it intentionally. I wasn't doing it like I didn't actually think that thought consciously, but I had to have some things reflected back to me so that I was like, oh no, like I need to be the older colleague that I wished that I had had, not the one that I did have. And I think that like the other thing I would say to colleagues who are in older generations than Gen Z is like, do your healing work. Do your healing work because we don't want to pass it on to the next generation. Like I don't want to I want you to have less toxic work experiences than I did. Um, thank you all so much for coming. Like I said, this is a monthly event. We're so grateful to it. It'll be up on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. If you got something out of it, please show your gratitude by making a donation. This is how we keep these kinds of events going and free for everybody. And also, we would love to hear about the youth organizing, the intergenerational organizing that you all are doing as well. So don't be a stranger. We love collaborating with other folks doing intergenerational work. John, we know you have done great work with Gen Action, so it's always good to see you here as well. So everyone have a good night and thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again next month.